The dust devil whirled past the whitewashed walls of San Miguel Mission, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant promises. Jake Coleman pulled his weathered hat low against the New Mexico sun as his horse's hooves echoed hollowly on the hard-packed earth of the mission courtyard. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, and his bones ached with the familiar weariness that came from too many miles and too few answers. The mission bell tower cast a sharp shadow across the ground where Jake dismounted, his spurs jangling softly as his boots hit the dust. Something caught his eye immediately, patterns in the earth that made him freeze mid-step. There, carefully drawn in the fine dirt near the church entrance, were 3 perfect circles connected by a straight line, with smaller marks radiating outward like the rays of the sun. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen these symbols before years ago, when the mescalero Apache had found him half dead from a rattler bite and nursed him back to health. The circles represented the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, but more importantly, they were a cry for help, a message that someone of Apache blood was trapped and calling to their ancestors for guidance. "Senor, can I help you?" The voice belonged to a middle-aged priest, emerging from the mission's heavy wooden doors. Father Miguel Santos moved with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to dealing with rough frontier visitors, his brown Franciscan robes rustling in the afternoon breeze. "Name's Jake Coleman, Father. Just passing through, wondering if I might water my horse and maybe find a meal." Jake's eyes never left the symbols in the dust. "Mighty fine mission you got here. Gracias, Senor Coleman. We welcome all travelers in God's house. My sister Maria will see to your needs." Father Miguel's gaze followed Jake's stare to the ground. "Ah, you notice the markings. The wind plays strange tricks in the desert, no? Always shifting the sand into curious patterns." Jake nodded slowly, but his jaw tightened. These weren't random wind patterns, and any man who'd lived on the frontier long enough would know it. Someone had drawn these symbols deliberately, and recently, the edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the constant desert breeze. As if summoned by their conversation, a young woman appeared in the mission doorway. But it wasn't the priest's sister who caught Jake's attention. It was the girl behind her, perhaps 16 years old, with long black hair braided severely down her back and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than her years. She wore the simple brown dress of the mission, but something in her bearing, in the proud set of her shoulders, spoke of different origins. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Jake saw recognition flicker there, not of him personally, but of what he represented. She glanced quickly at the symbols in the dust, then back at his face, and in that brief exchange, Jake understood everything. "This is Aiyana," Father Miguel said, his voice carrying the particular tone adults used when speaking of a troublesome but beloved child. "She helps with the mission work. Aiyana, please take Senor Coleman's horse to the stable." The girl moved forward with fluid grace, but as she passed the symbols in the dust, her foot deliberately scattered the outer rays while leaving the 3 connected circles intact. The message was clear. "I am Apache. I need help, but I must be careful." "Much obliged, miss," Jake said quietly as she took his horse's reins. For just a moment their hands brushed, and he felt the calluses on her palms, not the soft hands of a sheltered mission girl, but the strong fingers of someone who remembered other work, other ways of life. "De nada, senor," she replied, her voice carefully modulated to show proper deference, but her eyes held his for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and in Spanish tinged with something else, an accent that spoke of different rhythms, different songs. She added, "The sun grows long. Soon the shadows will dance." As she led his horse away, Jake felt the desert wind shift around him, carrying new possibilities and old dangers. The Apache girl was communicating in the ancient way, through symbols, through careful words that held double meanings. She was telling him that time was running short, that whatever had brought her to draw those circles in the dust was reaching a crisis point. Father Miguel was still watching him carefully. "You seem interested in our young ward, Senor Coleman. Aiyana came to us 8 years ago, rescued from a life of difficulty. We have given her the blessings of civilization and Christian instruction." "Rescued?" Jake repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "From her family, you mean?" The priest's expression hardened slightly. "From savagery, senor. From a life without God's grace or proper moral instruction. She is much better off here, learning the ways of decent society." Jake touched the brim of his hat and said nothing, but his mind was racing. 8 years ago would have made the girl only 8 when she was taken, old enough to remember her true people, old enough to carry their ways in her heart, despite years of forced conversion. As the mission bell began to toll the evening call to prayer, Jake watched Aiyana emerge from the stable. She moved past the scattered symbols again, and this time she drew 3 new circles with the toe of her boot. But these were smaller, more urgent. The message was changing. Time was running out. The pre-dawn air carried a chill that cut through Jake's worn duster as he made his way to the mission well. Sleep had eluded him through the night, his mind churning over the girl's symbols and the desperate urgency he'd seen in her dark eyes. The mission grounds lay quiet, except for the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. He wasn't surprised to find Aiyana already there, drawing water with the measured movements of someone performing a familiar ritual. But what stopped him cold was what she was doing with the wet earth at her feet, carefully shaping it into the sacred spiral pattern that Apache mothers used to teach their daughters about the path of womanhood. "Your people call it the life road," Jake said quietly in Apache, his voice barely above a whisper. Aiyana's hands stilled on the rope, and water sloshed back into the well. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. For a moment, she seemed poised to flee like a startled deer. You speak the language of my grandmother," she whispered back in Apache, her voice trembling with emotion she'd kept buried for 8 years. "I lived with the Mescalero for 3 seasons," Jake replied, still speaking her native tongue. "After they saved my life from a rattler bite up in the Sacramento Mountains, they taught me many things, including how to read the old signs." Tears gathered in Aiyana's eyes, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to hold back a sob. "I thought I was the only one. I thought everyone who knew the true ways was gone. Your family, taken by soldiers when I was small. My mother, my little brother," her voice broke. "Father Miguel says they are dead, that God called me here to save my soul. But sometimes, in dreams, I hear my grandmother singing the dawn song." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, not at the girl, but at the well-meaning destruction that had torn her from everything she'd known. "What's brought you to draw the help circles now after all these years?" Aiyana glanced nervously toward the mission buildings, then stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. 3 days ago, a trader brought news. He said there's a band of Apache camped near the Organ Mountains, survivors from different tribes living together. He described their leader, a woman with a scar on her left hand from a cooking fire. She held up her own left hand, showing a small, matching scar. "My mother had the same mark. I gave it to her when I was learning to tend the flames." Jake's pulse quickened. "You think she's alive?" "I know it in my heart, the way I know the sun will rise." But Sheriff Bradley heard the same story. "He's been talking about organizing a posse to drive them away before they can raid the settlements. He says all Apache are raiders and killers." "And you want to warn them?" "I want to go home," Aiyana said fiercely, her carefully maintained mission demeanor cracking to reveal the warrior spirit beneath. "I want to see my mother's face and tell her I never forgot the songs she taught me. I want to feel like myself again, not this empty shell they've made me into." The sound of footsteps on gravel made them both freeze. Father Miguel appeared around the corner of the mission, his face creased with concern, as he took in the sight of Jake and Aiyana in deep conversation. "Aiyana, child, what are you doing out here so early? And Senor Coleman, I trust you slept well?" "Couldn't sleep, Father," Jake said easily, switching back to English. "Thought I'd help the young lady with the morning chores. My mama always said a gentleman lends a hand where he can." Father Miguel's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the wet earth patterns at Aiyana's feet, but the girl quickly scuffed them away with her boot. "I was just drawing water for the morning washing, Padre," she said, her voice once again the properly submissive tone of a mission ward. "Very good. But you know you should not be alone with strange men, even in the Lord's house. It is not proper." The priest's voice carried gentle reproach, but Jake caught the underlying steel. "Senor Coleman, perhaps you would join us for morning prayers before you continue your journey." "Much obliged, Father. Always happy to give thanks for the Lord's blessings." As they walked toward the chapel, Aiyana fell into step behind them, as was expected of her station, but Jake felt rather than saw her brush against his elbow, and when he looked down, he found a small piece of charcoal pressed into his palm, along with something else. A tiny braid of sweetgrass, no bigger than his thumb but unmistakably Apache in its weaving. The message was clear. She trusted him, and more than that, she was asking him to help her reclaim her heritage, even if it meant defying everything the mission stood for. As the chapel bells began to toll, calling the faithful to morning prayers, Jake closed his fist around the sweetgrass braid and made his decision. The girl deserved to know if her mother was alive, and she deserved the chance to choose her own path, even if that choice led straight into the heart of a gathering storm. Behind them, unnoticed in the strengthening dawn light, Sheriff Tom Bradley sat his horse on the ridge overlooking the mission. He'd been watching through his field glasses, and what he'd seen of the intimate conversation between the drifter and the Apache girl set his teeth on edge. In his experience, any white man who spoke comfortable Apache was either a trader, a spy, or a traitor, and with hostile tribes gathering in the mountains, Tom Bradley wasn't inclined to give anyone the benefit of the doubt. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly down on the dusty main street of San Miguel as Jake tied his horse outside Hernandez's general store. He'd spent the morning helping with mission repairs, all the while keeping one eye on Aiyana and another on the horizon. The girl had been subdued since their dawn conversation, performing her duties with mechanical precision, while her eyes held the distant look of someone whose heart was already traveling toward the mountains. The store's bell jangled as Jake pushed through the door, seeking supplies for what he increasingly suspected would be a dangerous journey. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of tobacco, leather, and dried chilies hanging from the ceiling beams. "Afternoon, stranger." The voice belonged to a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest, and suspicious eyes that had clearly seen too much frontier violence. Tom Bradley stood near the counter, his hand resting casually on his gun belt as he sized up Jake with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Sheriff," Jake nodded politely, continuing toward the shelves of canned goods. "Fine day for it." "Depends on what it is, I reckon." Bradley's voice carried the lazy drawl of a man comfortable with intimidation. "Don't believe I caught your name yesterday when you rode into town." "Jake Coleman, just passing through on my way to Colorado." "Is that so? Funny thing. Old Miguel mentioned you were mighty interested in his Apache ward, even spoke some of their heathen language from what I hear." Jake's hand stilled on a can of beans. The store had gone quiet, except for the buzz of flies against the window glass. Even Senor Hernandez behind the counter seemed to be holding his breath. "I've picked up words here and there," Jake said carefully. "Man travels the frontier long enough, he learns to communicate with all sorts of folks." "That's one way to put it." Bradley stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Course, there's another way to look at it. Man who speaks Apache too comfortable-like might be the sort who's been trading with hostiles. Maybe even supplying them with ammunition and information about settlements. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff." "Ain't making accusations yet, just observations." Bradley's smile was cold as winter wind. "But I will tell you this. We got word that there's Apache gathering up in the Organs. Maybe planning raids, maybe just passing through. Either way, I aim to make sure they keep moving. And I aim to make sure no one in my territory is giving them aid and comfort." Jake met the sheriff's stare without flinching. "Seems like a man in your position would want to know the difference between hostile war parties and peaceful families just trying to survive. Only good Apache is a dead Apache, far as I'm concerned. They forfeited any claim to mercy when they started scalping settlers and stealing children." Bradley's voice hardened with old hatred. "Lost my brother to a Apache raid 10 years back. They burned his cabin, killed his wife, took their little girl, never found her body." The pain in the sheriff's voice was real, Jake realized, which made him all the more dangerous. Men driven by personal grief rarely distinguished between the guilty and the innocent. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said quietly, "but that doesn't mean every Apache is responsible for what happened to your family, don't it?" Bradley's hand moved closer to his gun. "Tell me, Coleman, you ever seen what they do to white captives? You ever found a homestead where they left their calling card?" Before Jake could answer, the store door burst open with a violence that made everyone jump. A young Mexican vaquero stumbled in, his clothes torn and dusty, his face streaked with sweat and fear. "Sheriff Bradley," he gasped, "come quick, there's been an attack." Bradley's gun was in his hand before the words finished echoing. "Where? Who?" "The Weatherby place, maybe 5 miles north. Apache raiders hit them at dawn. House is still smoking." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. If there had been an actual raid, it would be impossible to convince anyone that the Apache band in the mountains was peaceful. Every Apache in the territory would be painted with the same brush, including Aiyana's mother, if she was truly among the survivors. "Anyone left alive?" Bradley demanded, already striding toward the door. "Senor Weatherby and his son got away. They was out checking on the cattle when it happened. But Senora Weatherby," the vaquero's voice broke, "they found her in the garden. And the house. They took everything, burned the rest." Bradley turned back to Jake, his eyes blazing with vindicated fury. Still think I should be making nice distinctions between good Indians and bad ones, Coleman? Still think they're just peaceful families trying to survive? Jake said nothing, but his mind was racing. Something about this felt wrong. Apache raiders typically struck fast and moved on, but they rarely burned homesteads unless they were sending a specific message, and the timing was too convenient, coming just as Aiyana was desperate to reach the mountain camp. "I'm riding out there now," Bradley announced, "and then I'm organizing every able-bodied man in the territory. We're going to hunt down this Apache band and finish them before they can strike again." His gaze fixed on Jake like a rifle sight. "I trust you'll want to volunteer for this noble cause, Coleman, unless you got somewhere more pressing to be." It wasn't really a question, and Jake knew it. Refusing would mark him as a suspect, but joining the posse would make him complicit in what could be a massacre of innocent people, including the woman Aiyana believed to be her mother. Outside, he could hear horses gathering, men shouting, the metallic sound of weapons being checked and loaded. The machinery of frontier justice was grinding into motion, and once it started, it would be nearly impossible to stop. Jake looked out the window and saw Father Miguel hurrying across the street toward the mission, his face pale with worry. Behind him, barely visible in the shadow of the chapel doorway, stood Aiyana. Even from this distance, Jake could see the terror in her posture as she realized what the commotion meant. Time had just run out for all of them. "I'll get my rifle," Jake said finally, knowing he had no choice but to play along until he could find a way to protect the innocent, both the girl at the mission and whoever was hiding in the mountains. Sheriff Bradley's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "I was hoping you'd see it that way, Coleman. Real civic-minded of you." As Jake walked toward the door, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the store window. A man caught between two worlds, trusted by neither, and running out of time to save anyone. The mission chapel had never felt smaller to Aiyana as she knelt before the wooden crucifix, her hands clasped in the posture of prayer that had become as natural as breathing over 8 long years. But tonight, instead of the Ave Maria, her lips moved silently through the ancient Apache song her grandmother had taught her, the prayer for guidance when all paths led through darkness. Outside, the sounds of the forming posse echoed across the mission grounds. Men's voices rough with anger and purpose, the metallic click of rifles being loaded, the stamp and snort of horses sensing their riders' tension. Sheriff Bradley had given them until dawn to gather supplies and weapons before they rode for the mountains. "My child, you seem troubled." Aiyana didn't turn at Father Miguel's gentle voice. She'd heard his sandaled feet on the stone floor, had felt his presence settle into the pew behind her like a familiar shadow. For 8 years he'd been her protector, her teacher, her closest thing to family in this world that demanded she forget who she'd once been. "I am praying for the souls of the dead, Padre," she said quietly, the Spanish words feeling heavy on her tongue, "and for wisdom to know God's will." "The attack on the Weatherby family has shaken us all," Father Miguel said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine sorrow. "Violence begets violence in this harsh land. I fear what tomorrow may bring." Aiyana finally turned to face him, and the priest was startled by the intensity in her dark eyes. "What if the people they hunt are innocent, Padre? What if they are simply trying to survive like any of God's creatures?" Father Miguel's weathered face creased with concern. "My child, I know your heart is tender toward those of your former people, but you must understand the Apache way is the way of violence. It is why God led you to us, so that you might be saved from that darkness." "My mother never raised a hand in violence," Aiyana said quietly, her voice trembling with long-suppressed emotion. "She taught me to gather healing plants, to weave baskets, to sing the dawn songs. She told me stories of the first people who walked in harmony with the earth. Was that darkness, Padre?" The priest's expression softened with genuine affection and sorrow. "Aiyana, mihija, your mother was killed by soldiers 8 years ago. I know it pains you, but holding on to these memories only brings suffering. Your true family is here now with Christ and his church." "What if she wasn't killed?" The words burst from Aiyana like water through a broken dam. "What if she's alive, hiding in the mountains with other survivors? What if tomorrow's attack will murder innocent people whose only crime is refusing to die when the world tried to destroy them?" Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, as he studied the girl he'd raised from childhood. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of years. "Even if such a thing were possible, which it is not, what would you have me do? I am one old priest. I cannot stop Sheriff Bradley or change the hearts of frightened men seeking justice for their murdered neighbors." Aiyana rose from her knees, her decision crystallizing like ice in her chest. "Then I must try." "Child, no." Father Miguel's voice sharpened with alarm. "Whatever you are thinking, I'm thinking that for 8 years I've let others choose my path. You chose to take me from my people because you believed it was God's will. Sheriff Bradley chooses to hunt them because he believes all Apache are murderers. But no one has asked what I choose." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I choose to warn them. I choose to give them a chance to flee before the posse arrives. I choose to honor my mother's memory, whether she's alive or dead. Aiyana, if you leave this mission, if you aid Apache warriors in any way, you will be branded an outlaw. Sheriff Bradley will show you no mercy because of your blood. You could be killed or worse, captured and made to pay for crimes you didn't commit." "Then that is God's will," she said simply, "just as it was his will that brought me here as a child." Father Miguel's face crumpled with anguish. For a moment, he looked every one of his 63 years. "I cannot let you throw your life away on a dream, child. I will lock you in your room if I must." "You could do that," Aiyana acknowledged. "You have that power over me. But in your heart, Padre, you know it would be wrong. You taught me that Christ called us to protect the innocent. You taught me that love requires sacrifice. If my people, my blood, are about to be murdered, how can I stay silent and still call myself a Christian?" The chapel fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the open windows and the distant sounds of the gathering posse. Father Miguel stared at the girl he'd raised, seeing perhaps for the first time not the grateful child he'd rescued, but the woman she'd become. A woman torn between two worlds, two sets of beliefs, two definitions of righteousness. "If I let you go," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "and you are killed, how will I live with that choice?" "The same way I've lived with the choice to stay," Aiyana replied, "by trusting that some things are worth the risk." Heavy footsteps echoed from the chapel entrance, and both priest and girl turned to see Jake Coleman silhouetted in the doorway. His face was grim, his rifle slung across his shoulder, every inch the reluctant warrior. "Evening, Father, Miss." His eyes met Aiyana's, and she saw her own desperate resolve reflected there. "Thought I'd pay my respects before we ride out at dawn." Father Miguel looked between them, understanding passing across his features like storm clouds. "Senor Coleman, I hope you will not do anything unwise." "Depends on how you define wise, I reckon," Jake replied quietly. "Sometimes a man's got to choose between what's safe and what's right. Sometimes those choices don't align." Aiyana felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized Jake was offering her the chance she'd been praying for, but taking it would mean abandoning everything she'd known for 8 years, stepping into a world that might no longer have room for her. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. "Perhaps he brought you here for a purpose, Senor Coleman." "Perhaps he did, miss. Perhaps he did." Father Miguel closed his eyes in defeat, knowing that the girl he'd tried so hard to save was about to walk into the very darkness he'd spent 8 years protecting her from. But in his heart, beneath the fear and sorrow, was something else, a grudging pride in the courageous woman she'd become. The first pale light of dawn was creeping over the Organ Mountains when Aiyana and Jake reached the hidden canyon where smoke from carefully banked fires whispered into the morning air. They had ridden hard through the night, following Apache trails that Aiyana remembered from childhood dreams, and Jake recognized from his years with the mescalero. Below them, tucked into a natural bowl surrounded by towering red rock walls, lay a camp that spoke of desperate survival rather than raiding war parties. Perhaps 30 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, tended to worn horses and patched shelters. These were the remnants of scattered bands, brought together not by plans of war but by the simple human need to not die alone. Aiyana's breath caught as she spotted a familiar figure tending a small fire near the canyon's center. The woman's hair was streaked with premature gray, and 8 years of hardship had carved new lines around her eyes, but Aiyana would have known her mother's graceful movements anywhere. "She's alive," Aiyana whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Jake, she's alive!" Before Jake could stop her, Aiyana was scrambling down the canyon wall, her mission dress tearing on the rocks as she half fell, half ran toward the woman by the fire. Her approach sent the camp into immediate alert. Weapons appeared in weathered hands, and protective circles formed around the children. But the woman by the fire rose slowly, her dark eyes wide with impossible hope as she took in the young woman running toward her. When recognition dawned, the dignity she'd maintained through 8 years of loss and hiding crumbled completely. "Aiyana? My daughter?" The Apache words were spoken in a voice broken by grief and wonder. "They told me you were dead. They said the soldiers killed all the children." Mother and daughter collided in an embrace that seemed to bridge 8 years of separation in a single heartbeat. Around them, the camp relaxed slightly as it became clear this was reunion, not attack. Jake made his way down into the canyon more carefully, aware of the suspicious eyes tracking his every movement. An old Apache man with the bearing of a leader approached him, his lined face grave with concern. "You bring her home to die with us, white man?" he asked in English, his voice carrying the weight of too much experience with broken promises. "The soldiers will come. They always come." "They're already coming," Jake replied quietly. "A posse led by Sheriff Bradley will be here within hours. You need to break camp and move deeper into the mountains." The old man's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the flicker of resigned sadness in his ancient eyes. "We are too old, too tired for running. The children are sick, the horses are lame. Where would we go that they would not follow?" Across the camp, Aiyana was speaking rapidly to her mother in Apache, pointing toward the canyon rim and the approaching danger. Her mother's face grew pale as she understood, but her hands never loosened their grip on her daughter's arms. "Aiyana," her mother said in careful English, looking toward Jake, "you must go back to the mission. If they find you here—" "No, mother. I've spent 8 years being who others wanted me to be. Today I choose to be your daughter." Aiyana's voice was steady despite her tears. "If we run together, we have a chance. If we surrender, they'll kill us all anyway. Sheriff Bradley believes all Apache are murderers." The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, growing steadily louder. The posse had found them sooner than expected. "There!" The shout came from the canyon rim, followed by the metallic click of rifles being cocked. "Apache camp in the canyon. They got nowhere to run now." Jake looked up to see Sheriff Bradley silhouetted against the morning sky, his face twisted with savage satisfaction. Behind him, a line of armed men spread across the canyon rim like a noose drawing tight. "This is Sheriff Tom Bradley." His voice boomed across the canyon. "You're surrounded. Send out any white captives unharmed, and we might let some of you live." The old Apache leader straightened his bent shoulders and called back in clear English, "We have no captives here, Sheriff. Only old people and children seeking peace." "I'll be the judge of that." Bradley's rifle glinted in the morning light. "I see you got a white man down there, and that looks like the mission girl with you. Release them now or we start shooting." Jake felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. He could reveal himself as a willing ally and try to negotiate, but Bradley's hatred ran too deep for reason. He could try to shield the Apache with his body, but one man couldn't stop 20 rifles. Or he could try something desperate, something that might save lives but would certainly cost him his own. "Sheriff," Jake called out, stepping into clear view. "It's Jake Coleman. I'm coming up to talk." But before he could take another step, Aiyana's voice rang out across the canyon in perfect mission-educated English. "Sheriff Bradley, I am Aiyana Santos of San Miguel Mission. I came here of my own free will to warn these people. They are not raiders. They are survivors." Bradley's face contorted with rage. "You lying Apache witch! No civilized girl would willingly consort with murdering savages." "Then perhaps," came a new voice from the canyon rim, "you should reconsider your definition of civilization." Every head turned to see Father Miguel dismounting from his mule at the canyon's edge, his brown robes dusty from hard travel. Behind him, to everyone's amazement, came Maria Santos and half a dozen other townspeople, including, Jake realized with shock, Senor Hernandez from the general store. "Father Santos," Bradley snarled, "get back before you get yourself killed. These devils have corrupted your ward and taken a white man hostage." "Have they, Sheriff?" Father Miguel's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to moral leadership. "Or have you perhaps let grief and hatred cloud your judgment? Look at them, Sheriff. Look with your eyes, not your rage." The priest's words seemed to break some spell, and for the first time the posse members really looked at the camp below. They saw children clinging to their grandmother's skirts. They saw old men with hands too arthritic for war. They saw the patched shelters and worn belongings of people who owned nothing but their lives. "The Weatherby raid," Bradley began, "was carried out by a different band entirely," Father Miguel interrupted. "Senor Hernandez received word this morning from Fort Selden. The raiders were caught 20 miles east of here. These people had nothing to do with that attack." The silence stretched like a held breath. Below in the canyon, Aiyana stood with her mother's arm around her shoulders, no longer the obedient mission girl or the lost Apache child, but something new, a bridge between worlds, a living proof that understanding was possible. Sheriff Bradley's rifle wavered, the weight of potential massacre suddenly heavy in his hands. Around him, his posse members began to lower their weapons as the truth settled over them like dust. 8 years I've searched for my family, Aiyana called out, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. 8 years I've tried to be what others wanted me to be, but I learned something in that chapel last night. Sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is refuse to let innocent people die for the crimes of others. Jake watched Bradley's face cycle through anger, confusion, and finally, something that might have been shame. The sheriff was still a man driven by grief, but he wasn't a monster. Given a choice between justice and massacre, he chose justice. "Stand down," Bradley ordered quietly. Then, louder, "All men, stand down." As the posse slowly backed away from the canyon rim, Father Miguel made his way carefully down into the camp. When he reached Aiyana and her mother, he placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. "Perhaps," he said softly, "it is time for the mission to learn new ways of serving God's children, all of his children." The morning sun climbed higher over the Organ Mountains, and for the first time in 8 years, Aiyana Santos felt like she could breathe freely in both of her worlds.